We're in the third week today of a series we're doing called I Quit. And essentially what we're doing today in the next couple months, I think for 8 or 9 weeks total, is we're trying to explore like actions and attitudes in our lives that we would be better off quitting. Actions and attitudes that really kind of hold us back from experiencing like the full and rich and abundant life that Christ wants to give us. And so each week we're looking at one, this is kind of the theme verse, if you will, for each message in this series, John 10:10. And I want us to read this out loud together every week. So let's join our voices together in reading what Jesus has to say in John 10:10. The thief comes to kill, steal, and destroy. But I have come so that you may have life and have it more abundantly. I love this verse because it's one of the very few places in the Gospels where Jesus very clearly, very concisely says, here's what I'm about. Here's my mission. I've come so that you can have this abundant life. And some translations say a rich life or a full life, an overflowing life. The kind of life where you just have this sense of this is just, it's all worth it. It's all good. And so we're looking at the fact that this life that Jesus wants to give us doesn't come easy. That there's lots of temptations, there's lots of things in our life that, as Jesus puts it, try to steal and kill and destroy this kind of fullness and abundance that God wants to give us. And so last week we started by looking at complaining. And we talked a little bit about how a mindset of being on the lookout for what we wish was different, what was going wrong. We looked at how that can rob us of the joy that Christ wants to give us. And today we're going to turn our attention to looking at comparing. And I mean that in the sense of comparing our lives with the lives of those around us and having this sense of we're shortchanged. Comparing our life with other people's lives and having this sense of, I wish I could have their life. Right? Now I'm calling this comparing, but if we wanted to use more biblical language for it, we could call it coveting. Right? Coveting, fixing your desire, fixing your attention on what other people have that you don't have. That's such a big deal in the Bible that it made it into Moses' top 10 list. It's one of the 10 commandments. In fact, it's the very last commandment that Moses gives. So you may recall after Moses had led the people out of slavery in Egypt and into a promised land, when they get there, God reveals to Moses how he wants his people to live. And there's lots of instructions given to them through Moses. In fact, Jewish scholars have counted them up, and there's a total of 613 instructions in the Old Testament. But there's 10 that kind of rose to the top as these are the biggies. These are really the most important things, the foundational things. And so the very last commandment of the 10 is this. Moses says, or God says through Moses, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female slave, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. So this attitude of fixing your attention on what other people have that you don't have, God says that's a no-no. Now before looking more at this command in particular, looking at coveting and comparing and what that can do in our lives, I thought it might be helpful just to kind of offer a few comments about the 10 Commandments in general. Because there's, at least in my experience, there's oftentimes some misconceptions about what they're about. And so I think maybe having some of this more general information in mind could be helpful as we look at this coveting command in particular. So the first thing I'll point out is that you probably noticed in this verse, there's things in this verse that might strike you as odd or very out of step with our life and our culture. The first thing that you will notice is that it's addressed to men. Right? Because it talks about coveting your neighbor's wife, for example. So this was written, and also, of course, there's other things that aren't really connecting with our culture, like slaves, for example. Most of our neighbors don't have ox or donkeys, for example. So it's obvious that this was given in a culture, in a period of time very different from ours, right? So Moses lived roughly around 1400 to 1200 BC. We don't know exactly when, but somewhere in the vicinity of that time. So that's a little over 3,000 years ago in a Middle Eastern context. So that's a very different social context than 21st century America. So that's why things might seem a little odd in this verse. It was a male-centered society. It was mostly subsistence farmers in an agricultural context. And in the ancient world, slavery was just simply a taken-for-granted reality that no one really questioned at that time. So that's the first thing that I would point out, that even though there's this like universal element to this commandment, that coveting is like a universal human temptation, the way it gets fleshed out in this particular verse originally, that was pretty limited to that one particular culture at that time. Okay, the other thing that I want to point out is that sometimes, and maybe you've heard this, maybe you haven't, sometimes preachers or other Christians will say something like this, that one of the differences between Old Testament law and New Testament gospel is that the Old Testament is just concerned with external actions, but the New Testament's more concerned with the heart. It's more concerned with internal realities. And so I want to point out to you that that's simply not the case, or at least that's an exaggeration. Because, as we see here, one of the 10 Commandments is certainly a matter of the heart. Coveting is something that starts within the heart. It's not just about actions, it's about what goes on inside of you. And in fact, the 10 Commandments are actually bookended by commandments that have to do with matters of the heart. The very first commandment is not to put any other gods before God, not to put anything else before God. And so that's certainly a matter of the heart. And then there's lots of commandments about actions, about stealing and cheating and lying and things like that. And then it closes with a commandment about the heart. So even in the Old Testament times, God is still very much concerned with matters of the heart, with what's going on inside of us. One last misconception about the 10 Commandments. Sometimes the commandments, the thou shalt nots in the Bible, they're sometimes interpreted as like burdens that God places on humanity. Right? Like God is some big fuddy-dud out there trying to stop all of our fun with these commandments. Right? There is an old joke that illustrates this point of view, and I will warn you up front, it is a mediocre joke at best. Okay? So if you don't laugh, that's totally fine. It's really not that funny of a joke, but I'm a connoisseur of bad jokes, and it's a joke that makes the point really well. So the joke goes like this. So Moses originally goes to God. This isn't a joke, not in reality. But Moses goes to God and originally gets 50 commandments. And he goes back to the people and gives them all the 50 commandments. And they start complaining a lot. Right? They start complaining about all these different rules. And so they say, can you get them down a little bit? And so Moses goes back and talks to God a little bit more. And he comes back to the people and he says, I've got good news and I've got bad news. The good news is I got them down from 50 to 10. The bad news is adultery is still in. I mean, it is what it is. Some of you like it, so that's it. Yeah, right. But here's the whole assumption behind that joke. The whole assumption is that commandments are things that are meant to like stop us from having the best life. Like they're meant to stop our fun. They're meant to kill our joy. Right? That's the assumption behind the joke, is that God's rules are somehow burdensome, that they're onerous, that they try to restrict us in some way. I think, though, that God doesn't tell us not to do things like lying and stealing and cheating, among other things, not because God is trying to keep anything good from us, but because God is trying to keep us from the mess and the misery that comes along when we engage in those things. Like if you were to read through the 10 Commandments, and if you lived your life breaking all those, I would be willing to bet you're not a happy person. Doesn't that seem fair? Like if you're constantly cheating and lying and stealing, like that's just not a good life, right? And so God's commandments, I'll put it like this, they're not meant to be life-denying restrictions. They're meant to be life-affirming boundaries, right? They're like guardrails that keep us on the road that lead to the abundant life that Jesus wants to give us, right? Everything that God commands is for our good. That's why God commands it, because God is for us, right? That's the heart of our faith, that God is for us, and so anything God commands has good reasons behind it. I thought of it on the analogy of like an owner's manual. The reason we trust an owner's manual, like for a gadget or an appliance or a machine or something, is because we assume that the ones who made the thing know best about how it should function. Right? That's kind of the assumption that we make. Whenever we read an owner's manual, we don't really approach it with a lot of skepticism about their motivations. Like, well, of course they would say don't put water on it. They just want to keep me from using it in the bath or whatever. I don't know, right? If they say don't put water on it, it's probably best not to put water on it, right? They made it. They know how it works. So we should trust what they say. That's how I think about the commandments in that sense of like, God made us. God knows how human beings function best, right? And so the commandments God gives are meant to facilitate that, to cultivate that kind of good life. So as we're talking about this coveting command, I just wanted us to have that framework in mind, right? That the God who gives this command is not a God who's trying to keep us from anything. This isn't a God who's holding back from us, right? This is a God who gives himself to us, who wants the best for us. And so if God tells us not to do something, it's for our best. Okay? All right, now let's move on to talking about coveting a little bit more in particular. So the fact that coveting is addressed in Moses' top 10 list 3,000 years ago shows us that this has always been with us. That coveting, comparing our lives with the lives of others, that's always been a perennial human temptation and something that detracts from our happiness and our peace. But even though it's always been with us, I would be willing to bet that it's a much bigger issue in our day. And I say that because I think coveting has been put on steroids in our age due to the influence of technology and marketing and social media that are influencing our lives more than ever before. So, while things like social media have their usefulness, it also comes with some significant dangers. And so I want to talk for a moment, because this has become a pervasive reality in our lives and one that we may not give a lot of kind of reflection to. So I want to spend a few moments kind of looking at this. I think one of the potential dangers of at least over-involvement in social media is that it can really ratchet up that comparing that goes on, right? Because we not only have the actual people around us to compare our lives to, we also have lots of other people's lives, maybe that we don't even know, to compare our lives to. And for the most part, we're comparing our real lives with very curated, idealistic depictions of other people's lives, right? So for example, when you have a knockdown, drag-out fight with your spouse, you don't normally take a selfie of that and put that on Facebook, right? What you put on Facebook is the great date night, right? Because you want everybody to think you're happy all the time, right? So it gives a very one-sided kind of depiction of things. And so what often happens is, I think, and this has certainly been true in my life, so I'll just speak for myself here and you can see if it connects with your experience. But oftentimes what we do, and a lot of times I think we do this without even thinking, we compare ourselves and we compare our spouses and we compare our families and our kids and our lives and our jobs with these like idealized depictions of other people's lives on social media, and then we just feel like crap for it, right? We may feel bad to start with, but then we start comparing it with all of these other depictions and we just feel even worse about it. So I don't mean to like sound too alarmist or too cranky about technology and stuff. I think there's a place for it. But I've just personally had this kind of growing sense in recent years that we've got to be careful with the role we let it play in our lives. So I'll share with you an experience I had a few years back that really got me to kind of thinking about this stuff some more. So I'm no longer on Facebook or any kind of social media. I do have a Facebook account that I just use for the church group and that I keep up with Centerton group and the Bella Vista group where I live, just so I can kind of get some information. But I don't have any friends on Facebook. I have the saddest Facebook account on planet Earth, basically, right? I've got no friends on it because I don't want friends on it. But I used to do Facebook a lot. And when I did, I had a friend who was both a Facebook friend and a friend in real life, someone I'd known very well but had kind of lost touch with because we lived in very different places. So anyways, this friend was always posting pictures of he and his wife, and he and their kids, and everybody in their family was just gorgeous. Like, when you go to Hobby Lobby and you buy the picture frame and there's that fake family and the thing, like they're all wearing the matching vest and there's a tire swing and everybody's happy? Every family photo they took was like that, right? It was like that perfect matching everything, and everybody's on top of the world, everybody's gorgeous, and everybody's cute. They always had matching outfits. I don't know how they did that. It seemed like they were going on vacation at least every other month. Like they were going on cruises, and they're just doing all this fun stuff. And they were roughly the same stage of life we were in, you know, and they had young kids. And I was just wondering, like, first of all, how do you afford all this? And how do you take all the time off work for this? Right? Like, how do you do this kind of thing? And they were always having date night. Like once a week, he and his wife would have date night, and they would post the selfies, and they were so happy. And they never wore anything more than once, as far as I could tell. Like they always had new outfits on for every date night. And so I started like coming up with this storyline in my head of like, I bet they go shopping before the date. They get their new clothes, and then they go out on this perfect date and have this great thing. I come up with these storylines in my head. I don't know if y'all do this or not when you see these things. Okay, so whenever things would start to feel like hard in my life, so whenever, you know how like even in the best of marriages, there's like times when like things just feel bumpy, you know, like things just aren't like clicking. And so whenever that would happen with Andrea and I's relationship, or whenever like family stuff just seemed like a burden, like things just weren't falling into place the way they should, the thought that would always pop into my head was, why can't I be more like them? Why can't I have their life? Why can't we go on amazing date nights every week? And why can't we go on vacations every other month? And that's just the thoughts that would pop into my head, right? And sometimes I would take those thoughts seriously. Like, what's wrong with us? Right? Why can't we have what they have? Right? And so I'd kind of beat myself up about that. So, a few years ago, I'll say a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, I got the chance to go visit these people because they live in another state. And I needed to go to a town near where they live, and so I asked if I could stay at their house on my way there. So I got to stay the night with them. And the curtain was pulled back. Okay. I saw kids having meltdowns, and I saw multiple arguments about money, and I felt a lot of tension between them as we talked about certain topics, and I saw looks of exhaustion on their face, and I had this epiphany moment of, wow, they're as miserable as I am. This is great. Like, that made me happy. Like it made me happy because I had this like, I suddenly realized like this fantasy that they had portrayed, and this fantasy I built up in my head of why can't I have what they have? Like it had zero basis in reality, right? I learned that they were just another normal family with an abnormally high amount of debt because it turned out they couldn't afford all those vacations that they were going on, right? So I left there feeling much better about my life, right? And it really jump-started, kind of just got me to thinking more seriously about how often I do that. How often do I make myself feel worse by comparing it to these unrealistic ideals that really nobody even has? Life is hard enough as it is. Would you agree with that? But we make it even harder by comparing ourselves to unrealistic ideals depicted on social media or on marketing, and then beating ourselves up for not being able to have that ideal. Right? We can make things even worse. So for the last couple years, while I was doing the graduate counseling program I was in, I did an internship where I worked mostly with undergraduate college students, so mostly young adults, somewhere around 18 to 22 years old. And one of the most common phrases I heard from young people in the initial session was something like this. And I would bet 90% of young people that I was in a counseling relationship with would start off by saying something like this: I don't really know what's wrong. I just know that I want to feel happy and normal like everybody else. It's that phrase, like everybody else, that always stuck out to me. Because I started wondering, like, why do they think everybody else is happy all the time? And of course, it's because this is what they see on their phones all day, right? Most social media posts are depicting some kind of image of happiness in some way. And so if you kind of engage in that unreflectively, it starts to create this impression in your mind of like, this is what life is like for everybody else. Everybody else is happy all the time. Everybody else is always having fun with the group. Everybody else is always out at a nice place. And here I am just sitting on my couch watching Netflix. Like that, I'm a loser. Those are kind of the thoughts that they would have, right? Yeah. So I would often tell some of these young adults, like, I would share this fact with them. I would share with them that 1 out of 8 students at that college seek counseling in a given semester. 1 out of 8. Right? So I would tell them, like, when you're walking back to class and you're walking between your classes, just try this experiment this next week. Start counting the people. And for every 8th person you count, remind yourself, statistically speaking, one of those people is in therapy. Because they're having some kind of psychological suffering or distress that they need help with. And for a lot of students, like that in and of itself was very comforting for them. Right? To just realize that their struggles were normal. Right? It's just like when I went and visited those people and I saw that they were just as miserable as I was. Like, that was comforting to me in some way, right? Do y'all get that?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure. Every once in a while when I'm talking, this fear comes into my mind of, oh my God, what if I see reality completely differently from everybody else? And what if nobody has any clue what I'm talking about? So I need to check in with you from time to time. Yeah, that's true. That's true. You know what I was thinking about? I'm going to just kind of go off script for a minute. I've started rewatching Cheers. Anybody like Cheers? The 80s? Yeah, so a lot of people like Cheers. Okay. I've started rewatching that for the first time since I watched it as a kid. I love that opening song. Right? Everybody knows your name and they're always glad you came. Right? I love that song. For some reason I found, I'll just be very honest, I started like tearing up yesterday when I was watching when I heard that song. And I was listening to the lyrics. And the lyrics are, we all want to go where people, I'm going to get it wrong, but...
People know our name.
What?
Well, we all want to go where people know our name.
People know our name, and they're always glad we came. But there's a line in there that says, we want to see our troubles are all the same. Remember that line? We want to see our troubles are all the same. Can we sing that sometime, Rob? Can we do that next week, maybe? Think about it. Think about it. Because I started thinking, like, that song, that's such a great description of, like, the ideal church, like, where people know your name and they're glad you came, and, like, you feel this sense of connection of, like, we're all in this together and we all have similar troubles. Like, I don't know. I found that very powerful. We want to see our troubles are all the same. I love that line. Okay. Let me get back to my notes here and see where we're going with this. Let me come back to a point that I kind of made earlier, but I want to say a little bit more about. Coveting, comparing, whereas it's always been an issue, I do think it's fair to say that it's more of a struggle for us. And I say that because if you think about it, in the ancient world, people could only covet real things in real life. They were limited to that. They were limited to what they could actually see, right? But today, we can get sucked into coveting people and situations and things that mostly don't even really exist in reality, right? They just exist in a fantasy world created by technology and social media and marketing. Let me go back to this commandment for just a moment. When I was working on this and kind of fine-tuning the sermon yesterday, there was an odd detail that stood out to me in this. And it's the part about coveting your neighbor's donkey. I just thought that was odd. And I spent more time than I should have reflecting on the fact that how interesting is it that at some point in human history, guys walked out into their yard and they looked over at their neighbor's yard and they saw their neighbor's donkey and they thought, that's a nice donkey. That donkey's better than my donkey. I need to have that donkey. Like, isn't that kind of odd that at some point in human history, people coveted donkeys?
Maybe he didn't have one.
Maybe he didn't have a donkey at all. Maybe.
It was the first car.
I just thought that was interesting. Yeah. Well, so here's the thing. Here's the thing. Let me have a little fun with this. I do think there's a somewhat serious point in this, but let me have a little fun with this. Imagine that there was social media in Moses' time. Just for a moment. Just for this little thing. Imagine that in 1200 BC there was Instagram and there was Facebook. Okay? And imagine that you're one of these farmers and you've heard Moses give these commands about how you shouldn't covet. But let's say on your lunch break, you can go sit and look at your phone and you can scroll through Facebook and Instagram and you can look at lots of pictures of other people's donkeys. Okay? So let's imagine this. Let's imagine that this is your donkey. Okay? What are you doing? We didn't plan this. So let's imagine this is your donkey. And I don't know a lot about donkeys, but I assume this is a fairly normal donkey. Does this seem like a normal donkey? I don't know. Let's just assume it's a normal donkey. And let's say that this is your donkey, and it works well for you. It pulls the plow. But let's say on your lunch break, you start looking at your phone, and you start seeing pictures like this posted on Facebook. You see these other donkey pictures. You see these goofy donkeys, these smiling donkeys. Right. And then you got these best friend donkeys. They just love each other. And they're having so much fun. And then you see this baby donkey. You see that baby donkey? And so your lunch break is over, and then you look at your donkey. And you start thinking to yourself, like, my donkey sucks. Why isn't my donkey happier, right? Why isn't it laughing more? Why doesn't my donkey have friends, right? You say, oh, my donkey pulls a plow, and that's all it does. It's like an idiot, right? This is what my donkey does. So let me ask you this question. If you're a farmer on Instagram in 1200 BC, and you see all these other pictures of donkeys, and you go back to your donkey, will you be more content or less content with your donkey? You'd be less content with your donkey, right? We have to be careful. We have to be careful not to let social media to hook us into focusing on other donkeys. Okay? Because then we will fail to appreciate the donkey we do have. Right? Now, as I was putting this together, I thought to myself, they're going to either think this is pretty funny, or they're going to think I'm very weird. Right? And it could be some combination of both. Some combination of both. I just hope I didn't make an ass out of myself. That's where I need to follow up. Oh, man. Sorry, parents. Some kids may need that explained to them later about the donkey ass connection. Okay. All right. There it is. There it is. All right. When I was putting this together, though, I should have come up with a better way to transition back to a more serious point. But it does make the point in a rather lighthearted way, I think, but in a serious way. That, yeah, like if we're not careful, we will, in fact, construct this fantasized, idealized image of what life could be like, and then we'll see what our life is like, and we'll just focus on that gap. And when you're focused on that gap, that's the biggest recipe for misery, when you're focused on that gap. I want to close today with a verse from the book of Ecclesiastes. That's not a book I quote too often, but it's in the Old Testament. It's attributed to King Solomon. And it's it's a very philosophical book. It has a lot of reflections on life. It's written from a person late in life, near death, and he's kind of looking back on his life at what made it seem meaningful, what seemed meaningless. And so as he's reflecting back on his life, he says this in Ecclesiastes 4:6. He says, "Better is one handful with peace than two handfuls with worrisome striving and a chasing after the wind." I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. Because the world that we live in today is designed to make us discontent. If you think about it, I just came across this stat. Just in the United States alone, marketers spend about $250 billion a year convincing us of things we need, right? And of course today, the Super Bowl is essentially like the epitome of the marketing day, right? And there's a game that goes on too, but it's essentially all about marketing. And so we live in a culture where we're always kind of being encouraged to think about, what else could I have? Right? What else do I need to be happy? And so I think this wisdom here, better is one handful with peace than two handfuls with worrisome striving and chasing after the wind. I think this ancient writer has some wisdom that we modern people tend to forget. Because we tend to have this assumption that contentment is about getting the next thing, right? We always have this assumption in the back of our mind that just the next thing and then we're content. And then we get that and then we're not content. But our culture teaches us to think that way. But this writer says, no, contentment is an inside job. It's not the next thing that's going to make you content, right? Contentment is always a matter of the heart. That's when it becomes enough. So I want to do something a little different today. It's not as different as the donkey thing I just did, I promise that. But I want to close a little bit differently today. We've kind of done this a little bit before. I want us to pray together, but I want it to be kind of a brief, it's going to be about 2 or 3 minutes. I'm going to kind of guide you in a meditation on this verse. So here's what I want you to do, and this may feel silly or weird or whatever. You don't have to do it, but what I want to invite you to do is put out both of your hands in front of you like this. And you can, if you want to rest them in your lap, you can, but your palms up. Okay? And here's what I want you to do for a moment. Just look at your left hand for a minute. And as you're looking at your left hand, just take a moment to kind of imagine and think about like what you wish was different. It may be that like you really want more money, or maybe it's a better vacation, or a different body, or I don't know, whatever it is. But just for a moment think about what you wish was different, something else that you want to have. And in your mind's eye, just kind of visualize like you're trying to reach out for it with your left hand. You might even just kind of make a gesture of like I'm trying to grab hold of it. And now I want you to focus your attention onto your right hand. And think for a moment about what you really cherish. Like think for a moment about the people and the places and the things, maybe even the animals that mean a lot to you. Just think for a moment about like if you lost this, God. Just think for a moment about what you really treasured. And in a way, just kind of imagine holding that in your right hand. Those people, those things, just kind of imagine you're holding all those things in your right hand. And now here's what I want you to do. I want you to take your right hand and place it on your heart. And I just want you to notice for a moment how that feels. How that feels to kind of hold close to your heart the people and the things that you just love and cherish and just couldn't do without. That you have right now here today. And now if you would, just take that hand and place it back in front of you where you're just looking at both hands again. And I want you to hear these words as you look at both of your hands. Better is one handful with peace than 2 handfuls with worrisome striving and chasing after me. And now if you would, take your left hand and just place it palm down on your lap. Just kind of put it out of the way. Now just focus on your right hand. And once again, bring to mind those people, places, things that you just cherish. And hear these words again. Better is 1 handful with peace than 2 handfuls with worries and striving and chasing after me. And as you continue to hold your right hand up like this, just close your eyes as we pray together. God, you've given us this handful of blessings. And we just ask that you add to it one more thing. Contentment. Because more does not make it enough. It's a heart full of contentment that makes it enough. We thank you, God, for the handful that we have. And we pray that we would hold it with peace as you continue to hold us in your right hand. We ask all these things in the precious name of Jesus. And let all God's people say.